please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Well, we're discussing the big bank fraud, and joining us now is Leo Puri, the Managing Director of UTI Asset Management. Mr. Puri, appreciate you joining us. I don't know if you caught the last part of my conversation with Rajiv Chandrasekhar, where he talked about the fact that we need a new model. What do we need, Mr. Puri? You know, I'm looking at Parliament papers. This fraud allegedly started in 2011. This states very clearly, during 2010-2011, the RBI took several measures to strengthen the frauds monitoring mechanism in banks and so on and so forth. The RBI, via its circular dated 026/2011, advised banks to suitably modify their policies, streamline operating framework. And yet we're talking about a situation where apparently two junior officials have been able to pull off something worth 11,400 crores.
Well, Shireen, I did catch the last part of the conversation with Rajiv Chandrasekhar, and I think the point was made as to whether this was a systemic or a specific problem. And there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that this is a very deep-rooted systemic issue. This is really not about PNB or two junior officials at all. This is very deep-rooted, very systemic. And if you'll just give me a minute, I'll give you my perspective on what I hope this will turn out to be a cathartic moment, if you like, for finally addressing the deep-rooted rot, systemic rot that we've created in our banking system. So fundamentally, while we nationalize the banks with noble aims of essentially driving financial inclusion, in the event, and this has been true for more than 2 decades, probably longer, you in effect had a form of reverse capture due to the patronage system which got established in terms of how the then nationalized banks were subsequently governed. And when you create a patronage system which involves the political class, the bureaucracy, bank management, and our entrepreneurs, essentially you create channels for essentially delivering mutual benefit, which essentially harden over time. And I think on all sides there's been a way of doing business whereby it has for long been assumed that the purpose of the banks and public sector banks in particular was to make available capital, low-cost capital. In some cases the presumption was permanent capital towards people who were broadly viewed as being in favor. Not all of this was corrupt or you know, arguably nefarious. Some of it was simply patronage. And patronage, I use the term in a neutral sense, but it certainly meant that there was an assumption that there would be a high level of guidance as to how these scarce resources would get channeled. And it's human nature that once you perceive that, you start to work these networks of patronage. And that infects the entire system. That's a dangerous and metastasizing sort of cancer that spreads through the system, where now you have patronage, which essentially determines how people are appointed to the leadership of these institutions. In order to earn the right to lead these institutions, they need to earn the trust of those who grant the patronage. In order to earn that trust, you have to be viewed as reliable in terms of not breaking the code as to how the system works. So actually we have deeply embedded, and that's why I stress the rot is very, very deep. This is not about PNB at all. This could have happened in any bank. And I fear will continue to happen as long as you have a system where the government owns and runs a patronage network through the public sector banking system.
You preempted my question
this has
then.
Been going on for 20
you preempted
years.
my question, sir. Yes, you preempted the question that I asked Rajiv Chandrasekhar, and let me put that to you as well. You know, one talks about the fact that if you list a government-owned entity, it will bring in better compliance. They will have to deal with the norms that a listed entity needs to deal with. I mean, these are listed banks. It's the second largest bank. So as you pointed out, it's not a PNB issue. It's a systemic issue. It's an issue of this way that these banks have been operating and they're structured. Is privatization then, is disinvestment, where government control is below 51%, then the answer, Leo Puri?
I think it is certainly a necessary condition. It may or may not on its own be sufficient, but it's absolutely necessary. Listing, by the way, on its own doesn't change anything. Having a minority shareholding where you bring in other investors but continue to have a dominant system of patronage left intact is hardly going to change the quality of governance. And unless you change the quality of governance, that has led to the second order issues around difficulty of attracting talent, difficulty of building meritocracy, difficulty of creating professionalism in institutions. And I think that's what's essentially happened here. So now, would it be sufficient? Well, of course, you can point to many examples in private sector banks which are not immune altogether from similarly seeing or facing accusations of fraud or missteps or operating risk failures. So it won't solve the problem entirely. But I think it's also quite clear that whereas, yes, you can point to examples where private sector banks have actually fallen prey to some of those tendencies, it has, in those cases, much more been the exception rather than the rule. Whereas, unfortunately, it seems to be almost taken for granted within the public sector banking system that these issues will arise.
Right.
So I don't think the two are comparable.
But
so
Mr. Puri, let me ask you,
but not sufficient. But we have to start there.
We have to start there, but in the immediate terms, and you know, I was having a conversation with three former RBI deputy governors yesterday, and they put on the table some ideas. Mr. Mundra said that he had raised the issue of the SWIFT system in 2016. He was worried about that, you know, that there should be a nationwide reconciliation when it comes to LOUs. That's his idea in the immediate term. There are other ideas on, you know, validation of the SWIFT system on a daily basis. In the immediate term, what do you believe is the need of the hour in terms of corrective action?
Well, you know, I think those are being laid out. I think you already have 4 layers of audit in all of the banks. I don't believe that this was an issue that was not more widely known within the system. I find that very hard to believe. Of course, you can look to strengthen operating processes. There are many things you can do after the horse has bolted. These are really steps that are tantamount to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Frankly, you will hear a lot of advice on these matters. I think the banks already today have technology, they have audit mechanisms. So I'm not sure that any of this advice is frankly going to change anything, even if it is implemented. I think the issue is fundamentally of deep-rooted rot resulting from a patronage system. And that must be now fundamentally, this must be a moment of national debate. In that sense, it is a cathartic moment. You know, what is encouraging about this process, in a way, the glass half full view on what is happening now, is that you are seeing a very sharp and pointed reaction, which perhaps you may not have seen some years ago when these sorts of issues were taken for granted. The amount of television coverage, including on your channel and media coverage, suggests that people really are frustrated, fed up, and you know, tired, angry about this. So there is a moment of catharsis occurring. And you could say, look, when you start picking up the rocks, you see more cockroaches crawling out. And I take some heart from the fact that what you've seen over the last few years is a genuine attempt at beginning reform in the system. There have been many genuine efforts made to start to address this. The work that the RBI has done on squeezing out the bad loans in the sector leaves less and less place to hide. Some of the well-intentioned initiatives that you were referring to earlier about the Bank Board Bureau and so on, while they may not have reached any consummation yet, have clearly also got people to think about accountability, and we should not be too cynical about what about what has been achieved so far in terms of a stronger commitment and strengthening the hands of those within the public sector banks who want to govern these banks better. So the measures to strengthen the hand of those, and they are the majority of the staff and professionals in public sector banks, who are equally frustrated as the rest of us about the way their bank is run, and the process of leaving less and less room to hide for errant entrepreneurs who essentially believe that they don't ever need to return their borrowings to the bank, has actually now created this moment of anxiety and crisis in the general public. And I think that's a good thing. I think we have to use that sense of anger and frustration and turn it into something positive.
Leo Puri, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 with your thoughts. We'll take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere.